The embargo is lifted. Welcome to the depths. Hello, welcome, and welcome back to Reading from the Depths. My name is Lecton. Thank you for spending some time with me today. So today I'm going to do a wrap-up of the first round of the BookTube Prize 2025. So the BookTube Prize is a community-based prize that chooses one fiction and one nonfiction book every year to celebrate. And I was a judge for the first round of the 2025 BookTube Prize in nonfiction. And we had an embargo. We were asked not to discuss any of the books that we read or not to give a review or rating of them until after the judging was done. So we didn't sway any of the other judges. And the first round ended at the end of March. It lasted throughout February and March. And so now I'm free to talk about those books. So really quickly, what is the BookTube Prize? Like I said, it is a community-based book prize. I will leave a link down to the website in the description so you can find out more info. But in short, the way it works is there is a master list collated or curated of anywhere from 80 to 100 books in nonfiction, and then as well 80 to 100 books in fiction. And I'm not entirely sure how those lists are curated, but once those lists exist, then everyone who signed up to be a judge then is allowed to choose up to 20 books on each list. And as a result of those judges' choices, you get a final list of 48 fiction books and 48 nonfiction books. And the fiction and nonfiction run in parallel tracks. They don't ever compete against one another. So that's why I was judging only nonfiction in this first round. And so once there are 48 books in the first round, they're divided up into groups of 6. So there are 8 different groups. And this year, every group was assigned 11 judges. I imagine that number changes depending on how many people sign up to be a judge. But then when you are given your assignment, whatever 6 books are in your group, you have to read all 6 over the course of those 2 months and rank them from 1 to 6. It doesn't matter if they're all 5-star reads or they're all 1-star reads. You still have to rank them 1 to 6, only comparing them against each other, against the 6 books in your group. And then when all of the judging is done, every group, 3 books go on to the next round and 3 books are cut. And that way the field is cut in half. So from 48, the next round will only have 24 books. Again, it will be cut in half. The next round will only have 12 books. Again, cut in half. The final round will only have 6 books. And then there'll be a gold, silver, and bronze awarded in both fiction and nonfiction. So that is, in brief, how it goes. And every round lasts 2 months. So I read 6 books, 6 nonfiction books, and I'm going to give a brief overview of all 6, my opinions of them, how I ranked them, as well as talk about what 3 actually made it into the next round. So I'm going to go through these, not in the order I read them, but in the order I ranked them. So first off, I should say it was an interesting group of 6. I had 3 that were essentially memoirs, 2 that were biographies, but kind of hinted at maybe being more than just biographies, but they're popular history and biography combined, and then 1 that was a pure popular history. So those were how my 6 broke down. Now, the first one, number 6, my least favorite, is 3 Shades of Blue, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Bill Evans, and the Lost Empire of Cool by James Kaplan. Now, I really wanted to like this book, and I was disappointed. This book didn't seem like it knew what it wanted to be. The book ostensibly is about Miles Davis's album Kind of Blue, which is one of the greatest jazz albums that exists. And yet, there's already a book that exists that talks about the whole lead up to and production of that album. So he couldn't make a book just about that because it had already been done. And so then it reads like maybe it wants to be a biography of Miles Davis, but Miles Davis already wrote a really extensive memoir, which is quoted at length in this book. So it feels like it doesn't know what it wants to be. So since it wants to talk about Miles Davis and his album Kind of Blue, as a result, he then includes John Coltrane and Bill Evans, who are the 2 other main or most important musicians on that album. It's a quintet on the album, but those 3 are the kind of most important contributors, both in the bigger jazz scene and on that album. So there's multiple targets that he's aiming at, because at the same time, he wants to talk about the development of jazz in America. And from when Miles Davis got on the scene, following the likes of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and the emergence of bebop as a style, and how that affected Miles, and how Miles was sometimes at the foreground, pushing into new styles of jazz and creating new things. At other times, he was more conservative and behind the pack. The story just felt rambling. It didn't know what the story it wanted to tell. It knew it wanted to be something about Miles Davis, but then it also had to be about John Coltrane and Bill Evans. But it was really like 75-25. 75% was about Miles Davis, 25% about the other 2. But since it had to keep going back and forth, you weren't always in a linear track, and it just felt rambling. It did not feel like it knew what it wanted to be or where it wanted to go, and as a result, it was a little bit all over the place. And that was not a real pleasant reading experience. I will say that the story it tells about the development of jazz was really interesting, and learning about how jazz evolved and how different musicians played a role in that, and how musicians were treated in America versus how they were treated in France, for instance, also was interesting. So there's a lot of interesting information and a lot of interesting insight. He doesn't hold back about the drug use and about infidelity and about all these other issues that are in the lives of these artists. So in that way, it's really raw and emotional. And there's a lot, like I said, really interesting information about what it is to be a jazz musician at this time and what it is to be an artist who's living at the cusp of your genre, of your art, like really always constantly breaking new ground. What does that mean? It's interesting, but the book is so rambling, it just gets lost. So that was number 6. That's why it was number 6, because it was so rambling. Now, numbers 5 and 4, I think I would generally rate them the same, more or less, but since I have to choose an actual sequence for the BookTube Prize, I'd say number 5 is My Roman Year by Andre Aciman. This is a memoir. Andre Aciman is the author of Call Me By Your Name, among other novels, and he grew up in Egypt, and they fled Egypt when he was a child, and he spent 1 year in Rome with his younger brother and his mother before moving to America. Meanwhile, his father spent that year in Paris, and his father and mother already had difficulties in their marriage before leaving Egypt. And my problem with this is, I'm not really sure why it exists. The writing is beautiful. The writing is really, really beautiful all the way through. It's emotional, it's intense, it pulls you in. And he has interesting things happening to him, but it's basically his senior year of high school. And like some of the ups and downs are obviously exaggerated due to his circumstance, yet at the same time, they're not that different than the emotional roller coaster that any 18-year-old goes on. And he already wrote a memoir of his time in Egypt as a child and fleeing from Egypt. And he's written other autobiographical work. And so it's just hard to know why this book exists, because it doesn't feel like it brings a whole lot of insight into him as a person or an artist, or any kind of aphorisms or ideas about life in general. I will say that the last maybe third or quarter of the book, he does start introducing these kind of pithy bits of wisdom that he ties to his life, and he tries to show how things that he was experiencing lead into bigger insights that he has carried with him throughout the rest of his life. And that was interesting. But he doesn't do that throughout the whole book, only at the end. And it just felt like a little bit too little too late. You know what I mean? So I really enjoyed the writing. I thought the writing was lush and beautiful and evocative and really skillful. Just the emotion behind everything. But at the same time, I was like, this is a troubled 18-year-old who is, in some ways, disenfranchised, in other ways, more privileged than others. And I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to get out of reading this. I think if you're a fan of Andre Aciman and you've already read his other autobiographical work and you want to dig deeper into him as a person, then you might have fun with this. Like I said, the writing is really inviting and beautiful and fun to read in that way, but there's not a lot of insight you can get out of it otherwise, at least not that I got. So that was number 5. Number 4 is Cher, the memoir, part 1 by Cher. Now, this is not written beautifully at all. This is written in a very conversational style. This really feels like you are sitting down with Cher, and she is just, sharing her inner thoughts with you, and which is a joy, but it also gets tedious. That is the main problem with this. It rambles. It goes on and on and on. She feels like your crazy aunt who has so many stories that she's just spilling them all out. And sometimes they go this way, sometimes they go that way. And that is the issue with this novel, with this memoir. It is really intimate. It doesn't seem to hold back. It's very honest. And it's amazing to see what Cher went through as a child and how she ended up who she is. Now, this memoir doesn't cover, it is only part 1, so it doesn't cover her whole life, but it starts with like her great-great-grandmother, and it goes until basically after her and Sonny had already broken up and at the peak of her fame in America before she kind of had a resurgence. So at this point, at the end, she's had the Cher show after the Sonny and Cher show dissolved because her and Sonny broke up. She had her own TV show, and it's right at the end or the peak of that is when this part of the memoir ends. And it's really fun. If you like Cher, you grew up caring about Cher, you want to learn more about someone who is such a pop icon in the American pop culture landscape, then it's a fun memoir. And like I said, it's very conversational. The writing is very informal. It really draws you in. You hear all of her like background thoughts quite a lot. Sometimes she's addressing you directly. Sometimes she's just musing about random things. But it does feel very scattered. It does feel like it rambles way more than it needs to. Like she just gets off on tangents and goes on them longer than she needs to. And so that is the big downside to this. But if you like Cher, maybe that isn't a downside. If you grew up listening to Cher or, admiring the work she's done, then you want to spend more time with her. So in that regard, maybe it isn't a downside. For someone like me who's interested in her as a pop culture figure and an icon, who I just want to learn more about her as a person as she fits into the landscape of American pop culture, I didn't need to spend that much time with her. So the long-windedness of it and the rambling nature of it is what kind of bumped it down a little bit. So those are my bottom 3. Moving up into my top 3, the 3 that I preferred. Number 3 then is Charlie Hustle, The Rise and Fall of Pete Rose and the Last Glory Days of Baseball by Keith O'Brien. Now, I will say about this, the subtitle is a little bit misleading. It leads you to think that when it says the last glory days of baseball, that it's about more than just Pete Rose, but it's not. It's just about Pete Rose. It is about baseball insofar as the things that happened in the larger world of baseball, such as player unions going on strike and salary caps changing and all of these different kind of sociological changes that are happening in baseball as a sport as it grows in America affected Pete Rose. That's what it means about them. But like as a cultural phenomenon, it isn't about baseball at all. It's just about Pete Rose. But that said, I think it's a really insightful look into Pete Rose. It humanizes him and it does a great job at showing him warts and all. And there are a lot of warts, but it also shows him as the kind of person that had a magnetic personality. You understand why he appealed to so many people, which is a combination of being blue collar, hard worker, go get him attitude mixed with light racism. Like there are a lot of people that just wanted to root for a blue collar white guy at that time, and Keith O'Brien never shies away from that. So he goes to show all the complicated parts of Pete Rose in a way that I thought was really interesting. And also, you can tell that he has a background in sports journalism because some of the scenes in this biography feel like a play-by-play at a baseball game. Like he does a really good job of knowing what moments he has to zoom in. So there are some games that were really critical for different parts of Pete Rose's career where you literally almost go strike by strike or play by play throughout this game. You really feel like you're there. You feel like you hear the game being announced to you. And yet he also knows when he has to zoom through things. When there are other sections where a whole baseball season will go by over the course of one page, whereas one game might take up a whole chapter in another section of the book. So he does a good job of focusing on what needs to be important for the reader to understand Pete Rose's story. When he has to zoom in, he does so really well, and you feel like you're in the baseball stadium. You can feel everything going on. So I think the writing is really, really smart. You can tell that he has experience in sports journalism. He writes about this iconographic baseball player in ways that humanizes him and shows off all his flaws and shows off how his gambling addiction caused such a downfall and how it didn't come out of nowhere, how it slowly built up and how it was given a blind and how many people knew about it and turned a blind eye to it. And as a result of that, it just metastasized to a point where it could no longer be denied. So I thought it was really insightful. I thought it was really fun to read. It kept me intrigued the whole time, and I don't really care about Pete Rose. I watched a lot of baseball growing up. I think by the time I went to college, my mother became obsessed with watching baseball. I'm from New England, so we watched the Red Sox, and she would watch every single game. So every time I was home from college, there'd be a baseball game on. So I'm very used to either watching baseball or having baseball on in my periphery, and this book gives you that same feeling. And I've been to a number of baseball games, both in Boston and then to AAA games in Rhode Island and throughout the East Coast. I've visited a number of ballparks. So I have experience in that world, but it's not something I really care about. Do you know what I mean? And yet this book, it really draws you in and it makes you care about the story of this person who broke so many records, who did so many things that were unexpected of him from everyone except for him, because he knew he was going to be able to break those records. And he knew he was going to have a name that was going to be remembered. So then it ended up being remembered, of course, maybe for the reasons he didn't want. So I really appreciated this book. I thought it was really well done. I was moved much more than I expected to be, considering it's a biography of a baseball player that I don't really have any personal investment in. So that brings me to number 2. The number 2 book on my list is Knife, Meditations After an Attempted Murder by Salman Rushdie. Now, I have a complicated history with this one. I've never read any of Salman Rushdie's fiction. And when there was the assassination attempt, I was interested in reading this once it first came out. And then I heard him do a number of interviews. And, my impression of Salman Rushdie, that he is a little bit, let's say pompous or full of himself in ways that aren't interesting to me. Or a little bit arrogant, maybe we'll say. And when I heard him doing the rounds, promoting this book, I just heard him in a number of interviews, and just the way he was speaking kind of turned me off and made me not want to read it again. Because, there's one thing to believe different things from other people, and there's another thing to actively disparage people that don't believe what you believe. And so I was turned off a little bit hearing him in his interviews for this book. But then it was assigned to me, so I read it, and I really enjoyed it. I think he comes through as vulnerable, as honest, as really open, and I was really moved by this memoir. I think it does a lot of work for him to realize that the only way he can get through this incredibly traumatic experience is to write, and to do the one thing he's done his whole adult life as a way to process his trauma, his grief, and his fear. And I thought it was really moving. I will say he still has that arrogance about him. Like he can't help himself. There's a point where he talks about people sending him letters saying that they're praying for him, and he can't just acknowledge that him being an atheist, that their praying isn't something that is personally meaningful to him, even though he is appreciative of them caring for him in whatever way is useful to them. Like he says that, but then he has to go in and just give a little dig about how they believe like in an imaginary fairies in the sky. Like he has to just give that little extra that says, I'm a little bit better than them because what they believe is foolish. And it just isn't necessary. And that is kind of my overall opinion of him. And I don't know him at all. I only know him from the interviews I've seen him give and the things articles I've read from him. But that little bit of arrogance, he couldn't help putting it in this memoir as well. And it's not throughout the whole memoir, but in little bits and pieces, it still sneaks through, even as he's being so vulnerable and so open and so honest. And it is what I was expecting in that regard, but it isn't pervasive. It doesn't overwhelm this memoir. And I really enjoyed it. I was moved. I think he does a good job of assessing his life and his situation and what it means to be a target for a random young man who doesn't know anything, who attempts to assassinate him for no reason. I think he has a lot of inner work that was interesting to see on page. I will say there's one section, he chose not to have any contact with the young man who attempted to assassinate him. He decided it wasn't going to be healthy for him. Yeah, he does a chapter where he imagines what an interview would be like if he did get to interview him and ask him these questions that are like weighing so heavy on his heart. And that part felt a little bit fanciful, insofar as all of the answers felt like straw man answers. It felt like he would ask a question, his imaginary version of this attempted assassin would give a response, and then he would have the exact thing to cut that response down and leave this person with nothing left to say. Kind of the way you always feel going into an argument, that you always are going to know what to say to leave the other person totally speechless. And it just felt fanciful and not entirely additive to the rest of the story. So I didn't think that was a great section. That was one small chapter. The rest of it I thought was insightful, it was interesting, and it was an interesting look at a very complicated person at one of the most vulnerable and difficult times of his life, which I think was a courageous thing to put to paper, and I think it was a courageous thing to share with the world. So I'm appreciative that he did, and I'm appreciative that I had the chance to read it, even though I was reluctant to do so. And that leaves my number one choice. So my number one choice from the 6 books I read is The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore by Evan Friss. Now, this is a popular history of the bookshop in America, and I just thought it was incredibly well done. It's well researched, and it's full of heart and emotion, and it's just really well laid out. So every chapter focuses on a specific bookstore or type of bookstore, and he uses that as a way to discuss a movement or a trend in the growth or exploration or decline of bookstores in America. So for instance, the first chapter is about Ben Franklin's printing press and bookshop. And then that is a chance to talk about how when the printing press became widely available, it started to spread in the new colonies and the role that easily accessible literature played in the growth of the colonies and the growth of a political and social consciousness. And then there's another chapter on Barnes & Noble, for instance, and how Barnes & Noble is a sign of a certain type of bookstore that is both a franchise, but also personalized. Or there is a chapter about what ends up being the book section of Macy's. It isn't Macy's at the time, but what happens when a department store has a book section, and who is it, and what kind of economic forces does that play in the bigger role? There's a whole section on, on the used bookstores of New York. There's a section on Black-owned bookstores and bookstores as a place of community and of social change. A chapter on queer bookstores. A chapter on bookstores that are used for propaganda, whether it be socialist or communist or Nazi propaganda. So every one of these chapters, it starts with one specific bookstore, but then it uses that as a way to widen out and look at a trend in how bookstores have grown and evolved and played different roles in the American landscape. I thought it was really, really well done. A really smart way to create this popular history. And in between every chapter, it has a small kind of aside or, an intermission where he focuses on one contemporary bookstore that exists now. And he just talks a little bit about that bookstore and the community that it's from and what it's doing for the community and what kind of trends it's reflecting as a contemporary bookstore that exists, which I thought was just a really nice addition to show this historical legacy and the contemporary results of that legacy. So I really enjoyed it. That is The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore by Evan Friss. That was my number one choice. And now what are the results of the first round of judging? Well, as I said, each group has 11 judges, and it seems like the 10 other judges that are in the same group as me all agreed with me, because the 3 books that moved on to round 2 are The Bookshop by Evan Friss, Charlie Hustle by Keith O'Brien, and Knife by Salman Rushdie. So my top 3 books are the 3 that moved on. So apparently we're all in agreement. And I'm not judging for round 2, but it'll be interesting to see how it goes. Now, just as a brief aside, a summary of my experience as a judge this year, I enjoyed the process of being a judge. I read books that I wouldn't have read otherwise. Yeah, I will say it was a little bit taxing. To read 6 nonfiction books in the span of 2 months is more than I usually would. And especially some of the books were longer, like Cher's book was quite long. And at first, I thought Charlie Hustle was going to be really long, but then you realize there's quite a lot of notes at the end, so that saved it a little bit. 3 Shades of Blue, also quite long. And especially since some of them, my biggest complaint against them was they were a little bit rambling, that really took a toll on me by the end of the second month. By the time I was finishing these books, I was glad to have finished all 6 of them. You know, I went into each of them as open as I could and gave it each as much effort as I could, and I'm glad I did. I had a really rewarding experience doing that, but it was a little bit difficult. And I can see why there are more people attracted to judging the fiction side than the nonfiction side, because nonfiction is such a diverse group of books, and trying to compare a popular history to a celebrity memoir is a difficult thing to do. And depending on the person, you might have very strong opinions about where those books fall in your own personal reading tastes, and it's hard to overcome those sometimes if you want to just analyze how good a book is in some sort of objective measure in terms of its writing quality and its conciseness and its ability to do what it is setting out to do. It's hard to do when the genres you're looking at are so diverse. So nonfiction as a category is incredibly broad, and this goes for fiction too, and literary fiction as well. So I don't know if it's easier on the fiction side, but on the nonfiction side, it was a little bit difficult to look. These are almost apples and oranges in some cases. I think I did a pretty honest job though. Like I said, I went into all of them, you know, open-minded, and I did my best to enjoy each of the books for what they were offering. And then through that enjoyment, trying to see across the 6 which ones I enjoyed the most and understand why. That it wasn't just my like predisposition, that there was something about the books that was more gripping for me. And that is how the whole thing ended up. So I think that's all I have to say. I enjoyed the experience. I enjoyed all 6 books, some more than others, clearly, and I look forward to seeing how the rest of the BookTube Prize 2025 plays out. Have you read any of these 6 books? Or maybe you were a judge and you were in a different group. I'd love to hear your thoughts about any of the books I read or any of your experiences with the BookTube Prize. So please share that down in the comments. But for now, I'll say thank you for spending some time with me today. I appreciate you. Please be kind to yourselves, take care of each other, and go slowly.